As always, it's a pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague Roger Lewis, who distinguished historians and co-chair of the series, and it's to him that I'll turn the floor over for an introduction, and afterwards I think we'll proceed as we have in the spring to quickly go around the table and the room for everybody to sort of say their name and affiliation or quickly so that our speaker knows who he's talking to. Roger.
Okay, I think it might actually be an idea if we could just go around the room and let everyone introduce himself, herself. I do want to acknowledge that we have the new executive director of the American Historical Association with us today, Jim Grossman. And even beyond that, we have the parliamentarian of the American Historical Association. Could we just go around the room and let everyone just briefly say who you are and where you're from and how you justify your existence in life?
I'm Erin Mahan. That's a tall order. Erin Mahan, I'm the chief historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure that justifies my existence, but my 4-year-old does, so. And I'm actually on the list, I think, sometime in November to talk about Nixon and weapons of mass destruction.
I'm Ken McDonald. I'm former chief historian of the CIA. Nothing you should possibly do.
I'm Chandler McDonald with State Department Publications, and I'm just chat here.
David Nichols at the Department of State Office of the Historian.
Red Austin, an India watcher, and the Indians took the issue of Parliament very seriously.
Jim Grossman, AHA.
Sharon Wells, George Washington University History Department, and my existence is justified by being a former historian of the State Department.
Jim Banner, National History Center historian. I'm Don Wolfensberger, director of the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center, and ordinarily I wouldn't give a plug for my own program, but since it's so related to today's, I'll point out that this coming Friday we're having a program at 4 o'clock on Is Our Constitutional System Broken? And on the 28th of this month, we've got the former House parliamentarian and former clerk of the Parliament who are going to be here discussing their book, Parliament and Congress. So it fits in very nicely with what Don's going to be talking about today.
Kent Hughes, Woodrow Wilson Center. I direct the program of America and the Global Economy, and justification is that our assignment is to save the Republic.
I'm Magdalena Marinari, history of the American University and I work on immigration.
I'm Brian Westerly. I'm at American University.
I'm Stanley Falk. I'm a military historian, retired federal historian. There's no way I could justify my existence.
I'm John Dibber, and I'm a historian at the Department of the Interior.
I'm Marjorie Sproul. I am a new fellow here at the center, and normally I'm a professor of history at the University of South Carolina.
I'm Felicity Subir. I'm editor of Perspectives at the National American Historical Association. But I'm not here as a journalist, I'm here as a student of history. That's my profession.
Bob Kaiser, the Washington Post, the Woodrow Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow.
Michael Les Benedict, Ohio State University constitutional historian and former Woodrow Wilson International Center scholar.
I'm Larry Altman, medical writer for the New York Times and a Woodrow Wilson fellow, reporting of the health of presidents and political leaders.
I'm Mary Theory. I'm a retired history teacher with just an interest in this topic. Not justified my
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the center.
So David, I'm a
University of Virginia, and I'm a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center this year.
I'm Susan Evans. I recently inherited on the Public Programs Program as well as Smithsonian National Museum in that country. And waiting for that practice.
I'm Brian Carpenter. I work for the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I basically just come here with Los Angeles.
I think most of you will know of Don Ritchie's many books, especially perhaps his book on the press correspondence, and he's now accomplished the near impossible, a very short introduction in the Oxford series on the United States Congress. I want to make just 3 points about Don. First, he is from the City College of New York. As an undergraduate, that gives you a certain outlook on life. He is also in the United States Marine Corps, which also gives you a certain outlook. And he is, of course, the historian of the United States Senate. You put all of these things together, and I guess you have what is called a congressional personality, and I demonstrate this by his photograph today in the roll call. Don Ritchie on the Congress and Parliament.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I should say about the Marine Corps business, I was a draftee, not an enlistee in the Marine Corps, but it was an interesting twist in my graduate degree. I just finished my master's degree when General Hershey found out where I was. And so in between my master's and my PhD, I spent 2 years in Hawaii, and no one bombed Pearl Harbor on my watch. So I also want to say, to follow up on what Don said earlier, that when I walked in, I saw this flyer, and I was very, very pleased that they're coming 2 weeks after I'm speaking rather than before, because when I began to work on this paper, I heard that there was a new book out on Parliament and Congress, went ahead and got it. It's a thick book, but it is a really solid, impressive book that switches back and forth between the Parliament and the Congress in every chapter. And from what I knew about the Congress, certainly I found no fault with that book. And I'm sure that what it said about the Parliament was just as reliable. It is a really worthwhile book, and I highly recommend it to everyone. But as I say, I'm really relieved that they will be following me, not because they would be a very hard act to come after. Just this last week, the Washington Times reviewed my book, The U.S. Congress, a very short introduction, and the reviewer commented that I had an institutional bias that kept me from seeing the validity of much of criticism in Congress. And, that was a criticism from the right, but it could easily have been come from the left, and it's in many ways a valid criticism. I have worked for Congress for over 30 years, and part of the reason for writing the book was to explain why Congress acts the way it does, as opposed to people who are trying to figure out how to change Congress to make it act in a different manner. Public opinion polls right now show that Congress is an exceedingly unpopular branch of government. But that's nothing new. One of my favorite quotes was in 1925 by House Speaker Nicholas Longworth, who said that he'd been a member of Congress for 20 years, during which time, quote, "We've been attacked, denounced, despised, hunted, harried, blamed, looked down upon, excoriated, and flayed. I refuse to take it personally," he said. "I have looked into history. We were unpopular even when Henry Clay was a congressman. We've always been unpopular." It's the nature of the American political system, I think, that Americans do like to look down upon the people that they elect to office. As an historian, my job on Capitol Hill is to understand how the Senate operates. In writing the book on the U.S. Congress, I had to, of course, also try to understand how the House of Representatives operates. I've done this from reading the notes on the Constitutional Convention, trying to decipher what the framers had in mind, and I heard this morning Justice Breyer on NPR commenting that if the Supreme Court was occupied by 9 historians, they would probably disagree just as much with each other about what the Founding Fathers had in mind as the 9 judges do on the court. But I've also read the diary of William McClay to see how the Senate and the first Congress operated and implemented the Constitution. I've read biographies of senators and histories of legislation. I've tried to parse the rules and procedures of the Congress. I conduct oral history interviews with a lot of the players on Capitol Hill. Some of the most useful interviews that I've done, at least for my own personal benefit, have been with the former parliamentarians of the Senate who sort of understand the logic of rules that whose logic escapes all recognition once you step outside of the Capitol Hill. And I've tried to understand why Congress has operated the way it has for over 220 years now, in a way that still manages to ruffle feathers and make people decide that it can't possibly work the way it does. And last year in particular, we got a lot of commentary from people about the health care debate. It was, I think, the most interesting legislative debate that's gone on in the years since I've been up there, because it exposed all of the processes of Congress in the House and in the Senate and between them over a very long period of time, with the nation riveted to what was going on in a way that just doesn't exist for any other legislation. And I heard constantly from people, both friends of mine as well as people calling the office, who wanted to know, why is the process such a mess? Why is it so disorderly? Why isn't it, why isn't it running more efficiently? And my answer to all of these people was, it's always a mess. That's the way Congress operates on a regular basis. You just don't pay attention to the other bills that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. This one has focused your attention. And in that way, it's a very good teaching device because it explains the legislative process. But that, again, may be my institutional bias. So in part for this presentation, I tried to think about, isn't there another way of doing business? And in fact, the matter is, most of the world would say, yes, of course there's another way of doing business. We are rare among Western democracies as for not having a parliament. Every other major Western democratic government operates in a parliamentary system, and they wonder about us. Why do we have this Congress? And so that's my presentation today, is about why a Congress and why not a parliament. There is an international parliamentary union that members of Congress attend on a regular basis, and it creates lots of problems for them because they don't fit nicely into all of the subject matters and the committees and other things that are operating on. But from time to time, we do observe what parliaments do well, and from time to time, parliaments actually look at the Congress and what it does well, or at least what it does differently. And there has been some feedback back and forth. Not from Australia, but from New Zealand, I had a delegation of parliamentarians who came to study the American committee system because they thought that American committees in Congress could do a lot more than their committees could. And I've noticed now in Australia, Canada, and the UK, parliamentary committees in the last decade have expanded their roles in being able to call ministers in for questioning in ways that they couldn't in the past. So there's obviously some give and take between the types of systems. But still, as a person who follows the American political process, I have to say that I'm, from time to time, just in awe of how efficiently and how smoothly and how quickly a parliamentary system can work. Take the recent British elections. They occurred on May the 6th. No party got a majority, but it still only took a few days of negotiations with the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition, and the Conservative Party leader, David Cameron, became Prime Minister and moved into 10 Downing Street on May 11th. Now, compare that to by the way, his cabinet, which would normally have already been in place, had to be put in place. It took a couple more days, and it seemed to take forever as far as the parliamentary system was concerned. But compare the American election in 2008. The president was elected in November. It took 2 months for him to be sworn in, and he was still naming people to his cabinet a couple of months after that. Again, Americans, especially in times of crisis, look at this and say, why can't the system work faster? And my answer to that one used to be, well, it does. It actually, what the current system is the reform. It used to take twice as long to get a president inaugurated, from November until March. And thank goodness we don't have to wait that long as well. We don't have a parliamentary government here, and there's a particularly easy answer to this question, and that is that we fought a revolution against a parliamentary government. That, in fact, having overthrown king and parliament, the original Americans were not interested in replicating either in their system. But they clearly learned from parliament. They had lived under parliament. They had rebelled against a parliament. They had a good sense of what was logical, and they had a good sense of what they opposed in that system. The Declaration of Independence accused King George III of having established an absolute tyranny over them, refusing to give his assent to laws that would have helped the colonies, refusing representation in Parliament, disrupting colonial legislatures by dissolving them frequently, and calling them together in distant and uncomfortable places for the purpose of, quote, fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Fatiguing into compliance with measures seems to be part of the legislative process even today, but in this case they blamed the king for it. It also condemned, the Declaration of Independence condemned acts of Parliament that constrained colonial rights and for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So we overthrew the parliamentary system, and we created our first form of government under the Articles of Confederation, which was a single-body legislature in which all states were equal, had an equal vote, in which there was no executive branch and no judicial branch, but in which members of the legislature served as, in a sense, ministers in a very much in a parliamentary manner. The Articles of Confederation had no powers to tax. It was such a weak system that it didn't survive its first decade. And in 1787, the new Constitution is written. And we, of course, do have insights. We have the notes from a variety of participants at the convention. While we don't know everything that was on their minds, we have a good sense of not only what they did, but what they chose not to do at that convention. They created a system that was close to a parliament only in the sense that it had a two-house legislature, an upper and a lower house, although in today's Congress we never say upper and lower, it's only the other body. They created a system, however, that was different in the sense that no member of any branch of government can serve simultaneously in any other branch of government. So the cabinet cannot sit in the Congress, nor is there a prime minister serving in Congress. In fact, the only member of the U.S. government who does have a foot in more than one branch is the Vice President of the United States, who is also the President of the Senate. And that was strictly because the Vice President of the United States exists to fill in for the President in case the President is incapacitated or dies. And they couldn't think of anything else to do with the Vice President, so they parked him in the Senate and gave him essentially the power to break ties. We don't have very many ties, and so Vice Presidents have spent, actually it was the first 150 years of the Republic, they spent all their time sitting, listening to the debates in the Senate. After a while, I think they realized that was cruel and unusual punishment, and so they gravitated down to the White House, and we only see them now for swearing-in ceremonies and occasional other events. But everyone else under the federal system is prohibited from service in more than one branch. A parliamentary system, by contrast, concentrates the powers in the hands of whoever holds the majority. All of the power in the hands of whoever holds the majority. Now that, of course, presupposes that there is a majority. And those of you who come from nations with parliamentary governments know that parliamentary systems, for the most part, tolerate and endure multiple parties, which usually means that no party has a majority. the most famous case of this was France between the Third Republic in 1870 and the outbreak of World War I. During those 44 years, France had 50 different ministries. Some of them lasted a single day. In Italy, there are at least 5 major parties right now, and some minor parties. There have been, I think, 37 different ministries since World War II. It's hard to count after a while, especially because the prime ministers keep coming back, and so you have to try to count on all of that. But take the Israeli Knesset, which has a dozen different parties, and that means every government is a form of a coalition, and coalitions complicate the efforts to govern. However, in a parliamentary system, if one party has a commanding majority, as such that Margaret Thatcher enjoyed in the 1980s, her powers are so formidable that her critics called hers an elected dictatorship. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Well, it was exactly the elected dictatorship and the powerful center of government that worried the authors of the American Constitution. Their job was to create a more powerful government, but not too powerful. They certainly was still interested in preventing the tyranny that the Declaration of Independence discussed, but they wanted a system that would avoid concentration of power. It would resist hasty action and would reduce any sudden shifts in public opinions. It would also hopefully forge national consensus on demanding issues. And so they did this, of course, by dividing the government not into 3 branches, but dividing the legislative branch into 2 houses. And James Madison summarized all of this in the best phrase in the Federalist Papers, in which he said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. There's people who didn't think that human nature was going to change dramatically in the future and that there were always going to be parts of the government that were going to try to concentrate power, and they managed to set up a system that there'd always be someone to balance them in the process. It's interesting as you read, when you're thinking about this issue, when you read through the debates in the Constitutional Convention, how often they referred to the British Parliament. Not surprising that they had been British subjects not before long. And I mentioned that I read William Mackay, who's the former clerk of the House of Commons, and Charles Johnson, who's the former parliamentarian of the House of Representatives, in their massive study of the 2 bodies. And they concluded that the founders of the American Republic used Parliament as, quote, a legislative model in some senses in order to avoid. So in other words, Congress was in creating Congress, they were looking at the Parliament not only to see what it did, but what they didn't want the new government to operate under. So in the debates, we read James Madison citing Parliament's abuses of its powers as a lesson worthy of our attention. And Pierce Butler, one of the other delegates, complained, we are always following the British Constitution when the reasons of it do not apply. So just annoying him in places that it just was not practical to do things just because the British Parliament did it. Whenever they pondered what might go wrong in the future, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention inevitably drew from examples of what they disapproved of in the British Parliament. At the same time, they understood that they were creating a legislative branch that would have even greater powers over them than Parliament had, particularly powers to tax them directly in ways that, because they had what was part of the American Revolution about taxation, but they were creating a very powerful government when it came to the power of the purse, which Madison said was the greatest power that the Congress would have. It's also interesting to look at the ideas that they chose not to adopt in the Constitution. And there's a wonderful little book called Constitutional Chaff, which is a tally of all of the ideas that popped up at various times during the debates that didn't go anywhere. And actually, many of those suggestions would have created a legislative branch that more closely resembled a parliament. For instance, the framers considered having Congress elect the President of the United States, and then also letting the U.S. Senate appoint members of the cabinet and the courts, which would have created a very different system. They talked about the issue of impeachment. By the way, we're holding an impeachment trial in the Senate right now for the first time in a decade, since the president's impeachment trial is a judge from Louisiana, who's being impeached. It's a process that the Congress goes through, regrettably, periodically. But when they were considering what were impeachable offenses, one of the suggestions was that maladministration be an impeachable offense, meaning you wouldn't have to commit a crime, you just have to be inept. And just think about how many American presidents might have been subject to impeachment under maladministration. Yeah. Well, what would you have gotten if you'd gone this way? You would have gotten a president who was closer to a prime minister whose term in office would have been dependent upon strength in Congress, that having your party as the majority in Congress. Once your party lost the majority, then you had been subject to maladministration as a charge. James Madison argued rather forcefully against these as being the equivalent of having the president serve at the pleasure of Congress. Now, of course, in a parliamentary system, when a prime minister's party loses the support of the majority and there's a vote of no confidence, the government fails. But under the constitutional, Congress has set terms, the president has set terms, and Congress is totally free to ignore the president's legislative proposals, reject the president's budget, refuse to confirm the president's nominees, and decline to approve the treaties that the president and his administration have negotiated. Also, party discipline is essential to a parliamentary government. There are all sorts of whipping systems that are involved, and even to the point of if you're going to break with your party on a major vote of having to cross the line in Parliament. Whereas party discipline is something that is talked about but rarely achieved. Now, I have to say that in recent years, the party discipline has changed very dramatically. And in this last Congress, we probably had more party line votes than in the last several decades combined. The parties in Congress have grown into more parliamentary structures. But for the history of Congress, party discipline has been something that leaders have desperately worked at, but as Howard Baker once said, leadership in the U.S. Senate, at least, was herding cats. The senators and representatives have held, and historically held, themselves accountable first and foremost to their constituents rather than to their parties. Even in the days, and there was a brief period from about 1903 until about 1920, that the Democrats in the Senate and the House had binding majorities in which, if that conference voted, two-thirds of the members of that conference voted on an issue, they would consider it a party matter. And then every member of the conference was therefore bound to vote that way. The only exception was if the vote went against the interest of your state. So if they were dealing with the tariff, and the sugar tariff was part of this, and you were a senator from Louisiana, you didn't have to vote for something that would be harmful for your state. It was remarkably effective. The Democrats allowed this to lapse at the end of Woodrow Wilson's second term. In 1933, Joe Robinson actually proposed that they do it again, and he was hooted out of the room, essentially. No, the Democrats didn't want to have a binding caucus. The Republicans have never officially had a binding caucus in the Senate or the House. So the other issue that they copied from the Parliament clearly was this idea of bicameralism. And even that was not a guarantee in the American system. Most of the colonial governments had been bicameral, but there had been great resentment against the upper houses as being tools of the king and tools of the royal governor. And actually, initially after the Revolution, several states abandoned their upper house, essentially, and decided that a single-body legislature was more democratic. By the time of the Constitution was written, there were still 2 states that were operating under single-body legislatures. So that was an option. And, of course, the Articles of Confederation have been a single-body legislature. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention, however, always worried a little bit about what they called an excess of democracy. And they sheltered, in a sense, the American system by initially making only the members of the House of Representatives directly elected by the public. The Senate was elected by the state legislature, and the president was then and is still elected by the Electoral College. And Al Gore can fill you in on all of those details about that. But part of this was that the sense that they worried about the impact of public opinion on government, and they sheltered, in particular, the United States Senate by giving them longer terms, by making sure that only 1/3 of them ran in any particular election, and by requiring that they be older than representatives. Representatives could be elected at the ripe young age of 25, and senators had to be mature 30 to be elected at the time. But that was the 1780s we're talking about. It could have gone even further than that. Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris at the Constitutional Convention actually suggested that senators be appointed for life and not be paid any salary. Charles Coatworth Pinckney put it more bluntly when he said that the senatorial branch is meant to represent the wealth of the country, and that the lack of a salary would mean that only the wealthy could serve. These proposals were ultimately rejected. Otherwise, the Senate could have become a House of Lords, essentially. On the other hand, the Senate has always been accused of being a millionaire's club. And quite frankly, it takes a lot of money to be elected to a United States senator, and it still is a body that represents disproportionately wealthy individuals. As early as 1930, the humorist Will Rogers commented that it took a lot of money just to lose an election to Congress, and certainly that's grown over time. The framers of the Constitution did give the Senate remarkable powers to advise and consent on nominations, for which there is no parallel in Parliament. Now, part of this is that initially the Senate was going to make the nominations, and in the deciding that the President would make the nominations, they shifted it to advise and consent. And that some state legislatures, I think particularly the Massachusetts legislature, had a provision like that. In a parliament, for the most part, naming other people is a responsibility that belongs to the Prime Minister without congressional consent. And only recently has the British Parliament and the House of Commons considered a select committee to oversee its appointments. And as I pointed out earlier, a number of parliaments are now adopting systems where their committees can actually call members of the cabinet in to testify. The House of Representatives had a resemblance to a parliament in having single-body constituencies rather than proportional representation, which might encourage more minor parties. Now, this is an interesting point because it's not a requirement of the Constitution that representatives be elected by district. And in fact, there have been times when, after a census, the state legislature couldn't agree on drawing up the districts, and all of the representatives in the state ran at large. And so it is possible that we could have a system where House members ran at large, and in which case it's possible that would favor the chances of third-party candidates. But the single district system, for the most part, has eliminated third-party candidates. There are a number of other reasons why third parties don't do well. The Electoral College is probably the best reason for that, and Ross Perot can explain that to you as well. He spent $19 million and got more than $19 million and got 19 million votes, I guess, in the 1992 election. Not one vote in the Electoral College, and this is why third parties in America have sort of risen and fallen. It's also one reason today why the Tea Party is a faction within a majority party, not a standing party. I'm sure the standing party would like it to be a third party. They would solve some of their problems along the way, but it is an internal faction within the Republican Party right now. If anybody who was elected to this next Congress as an independent, as, for instance, the candidate in Florida, who said he's not going to join any party conference, when he gets to the Senate, he's going to discover that the only way to get your committee assignments is to be a member of one of the other conferences. Now, you're guaranteed 2 Senate committees, but you're certainly not going to get your choice if you're not designated a Republican or a Democrat. And every other independent until now has chosen to sit with one party or the other. For years, we used to have the District of Columbia Committee, which was where anybody who didn't, get a primary assignment usually wound up serving on. There aren't any committees now that are, I would say, totally committees that everyone wants to avoid, but there are committees that everyone wants to be on, and the chances of an independent, for instance, getting on the Appropriations Committee or the Finance Committee without being a member of a party conference are just about zero. So the reality will sink in when candidates come and they choose. We have 2 independent senators right now, and they both caucus with the Democratic Party. We've had in recent years independent Republicans as well in the process. There are all these various ways in which the system has sort of shifted over time, and one of which being this issue in the House of having those designated districts. The American Constitution is written in 1787. It was modeled after the Parliament that existed at that time, or at least what they liked and disliked. Of course, the British House of Commons has also evolved since then, and it's gotten actually even more powerful in many ways than it was at the time that the authors of the Constitution were operating. The British House of Lords, which was a major function, had a major function in the parliamentary system until the Parliamentary Acts of 1911 and 1949 clipped its wings by removing its control over the power of the purse and really restricting what it could do in terms of vetoing bills coming up from the lower house. There was a possibility that the same thing could have happened to the United States Senate during the Progressive era, during the era when muckrakers were writing about the treason of the Senate, when public opinion had turned against the Senate as an institution that was favoring special interests rather than the public interest. And they could have followed the British model and removed some of the powers of the Senate. Instead, the progressives who believed that direct democracy was the answer to everything and that the sunlight of publicity and direct democracy would improve the system, chose to run a constitutional amendment that would change the form of election from state legislatures to the people. For years, political scientists have been struggling with this issue as to what really changed in the U.S. Senate after the direct election of senators. And one doctoral dissertation went on for hundreds of pages, and one of the few things it was able to quantify was that there were slightly fewer lawyers in the Senate after direct election than before, which the author thought was a detriment. I thought was a real asset to the institution, actually. But I've argued that the 17th Amendment is much more important for what it didn't change. It took away no original powers that the United States Senate had and left the Senate the single most powerful upper house, essentially, of any national legislature. The 17th Amendment seems to be one of those benign issues, but it's become a political issue. They're actually having debates in some of the western states about repealing the 17th Amendment, and at least in Idaho, I'm not sure about other states, it's actually written into the Republican platform that the 17th Amendment should be repealed and that state legislatures should elect senators. And part of the feeling for this is it would disrupt the federal system. The 17th Amendment disrupted the federal system, that the states were more closely tied to the national government when the state legislatures elected senators, and that we somehow done damage to the original Constitution. I'm very skeptical of this point of view because the authors of the Constitution, among other things, said that senators did not have to vote as a delegation. They would be paid by the federal treasury, not by the state treasury, and that there was no provision for recall of senators. And the Supreme Court has sort of ruled out the western states that have tried to recall their senators and said that if it's not in the Constitution as a requirement of office, then you can't define it that way. If that had been the case, then you could see that the senators would have been ambassadors from their states. But frankly, I think the senators of the early 19th, 20th centuries before direct election really saw their role in relationship to their states very much the way senators do today, and I don't think that most American citizens would want to give up their right to choose their United States senators. In fact, most United States citizens can't name their state legislators, and so in what way would they want to empower them to take over something that they have? But it's an interesting issue, and it's become a political issue in this election. British prime ministers enjoy powers that most American presidents would envy. When a government, and this was where the McKay and Johnson book was really enlightening to me, at least, about the efficiency of government bills in the British Parliament. After their second reading, they go through one day's debate on the floor of the House. The minister responsible explains the need for the provisions of the bill. The opposition puts its case. The backbenchers then get into the issue. There's a scheduled moment of interruption that everybody knows the time. It changes at different days. And that at the very end, the frontbenchers give wind-up speeches. The vote is taken. The majority prevails. If the majority doesn't prevail, that would probably lead to new elections. There is nothing quite comparable to that in the way that the Congress operates. Now, the House of Representatives has written its rules in such a way that it could, and it does often, deal with very big controversial issues within a day. But the House of Representatives is only half of the process, and the Senate rules are completely the opposite. Unless there's a national emergency on, then the chances of anything moving through the Senate quite like that are pretty slim. The Prime Minister of England is true, and Prime Ministers and other governments are subject to question time. And now that C-SPAN covers question time, they're really wonderful to watch as the minister stands up. These questions that are prepared in advance and distributed and all the rest of it. They parry them back and forth, and there's a lot of hooting and howling back and forth. There's a lot of commotion. To say, by the way, this commotion is one thing that you might see in the House on some days, but the Senate is not a commotion friendly body. The rules of the Senate are such that everything is very sedate in the body. And I visited the Australian Parliament in Canberra, where it seemed like everyone on the floor was on the phone. And any time anyone started to speak, they were jeered at from one side or the other. It seems in some cases by all sides. There's a three-tiered gallery system. The top gallery is glassed in. And I asked my host why there was a glass around the top gallery. And they said, well, that's where school children go. And they don't want the school children to disrupt the members or annoy the members. I said, oh, it's got to be the other way around. They don't want the members to frighten the school children by the din that's coming off the floor, all of which would be totally out of order in the U.S. Senate. The idea we actually had in this Congress one member of the House of Representatives who dared to say to the president during his speech, "You lie," and he was reprimanded by the House for this. You don't do that. You don't do that in a regular debate, and you certainly don't do it when the president comes to speak. But Alistair Cooke, when he was a longtime BBC correspondent in Washington, said that every single British ambassador to the United States was inevitably puzzled as to why Congress couldn't call members of the president to a question period and quiz them on current policy. And Cooke would explain to them that the separation of the branches prevented this, but that Congress had the advantage of being able to call the president's cabinet for scrutiny before its members. He argued that the questions and guffaws the cabinet faced in the British House of Commons could not be compared to, quote, as a form of executive torture to an all-day inquisition by a standing committee of Congress. And, of course, these are the same committees that confirm the cabinet minister, cabinet officer, secretary, and then also oversee, in some cases, their budget or at least their operations and can call them at any time to testify. Should they choose not to testify, Congress can begin impeachment proceedings. And, in fact, from time to time, recalcitrant members of presidents' cabinets have suddenly changed their minds about releasing documents to Congress when the word impeachment surfaces. Now, in many ways, the most astute critic of the American congressional system, from a parliamentary perspective, was the man for whom this center is named, Woodrow Wilson, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on congressional government, which was published in 1885 and went through, multiple volumes. I was reading the introduction to his 15th volume, which was the 15th edition, which was published 15 years after the first edition. It was a a historian's dream to have that much attention to a book that, in fact, is still in print and is still an interestingly useful volume to understand the way Congress operates. But Wilson admired the British Parliament, and he noted how different the American system of government was to almost any other government around the world. He said that the major difference was not between the president and monarchs, but between the congressional and parliamentary forms of government. And he saw Congress as a parliament without a prime minister or any other unifying leadership. And that's a theme that runs through the book as to why they need more leadership. In fact, in the 15th edition, published in 1900, he's happy to see that actually there have been some reforms, and the House has created a rules committee, and there are a variety of things that were sort of getting towards what he was lamenting in that earlier edition. What Wilson didn't like about the U.S. Congress was that the minority party got too much of a voice. He said parliaments don't pay any attention to their minority parties. They don't have to. If their majority has a majority, it can prevail without talking to the minority. But in the American congressional system, power was in the committees, and the minority were represented in all the committees, and they had too much of a voice. He regretted that members of the U.S. cabinet did not serve in the Congress. He noted that actually that because ambitious men felt that the only way to become prime minister was to serve in parliament, to get into the cabinet, to work their way up. He felt that we were losing this sort of talent coming into Congress. And mostly he regretted the lack of a prime minister. And he felt that there were not sufficient party leadership in Congress as opposed to the way a parliament would operate. He said he also noted that the president served a fixed term, whereas the prime minister served only as long as his majority lasted. He said a prime minister must keep himself in favor with the majority. A president need only keep alive. It's kind of an interesting comment considering Wilson's own fate as president of the United States. And of course, what makes this so important is it's not just an academic tract. It actually is a key to looking at how Wilson saw government when he himself became president of the United States in 1912. And it's a little daunting to think about some of the authors that you've read who have proposed all sorts of major reforms. Just think of one of them suddenly being thrust into the presidency and having a chance to implement these schemes along the way. But Wilson was quite successful, and of all the presidents of the United States, in many ways he had the most influence, at least on the U.S. Senate in the way it operates. But the President Wilson was the first president since Thomas Jefferson actually since John Adams, to personally address Congress. Washington and Adams had, and Jefferson had decided not to. Now, there was a variety of reasons. Jefferson thought this resembled too much the prime minister or the king going before the parliament, and he thought it was too much of a monarchy. Thomas Jefferson also didn't like public speaking. He was a great writer, but not a great orator. His party was in control, and he didn't feel he needed to manipulate things by going down in person. He could deal with things behind the state. So he created this precedent of presidents sending their messages to be read by clerks of Congress. Now, this had to be a really deadening thing for the next, from 1800 until 1913, every year the presidents would send increasingly long messages, which clerks would then stand up and read in the House and the Senate chamber. And one can only imagine how many members bothered to attend and to listen to this sort of droning on and on. State of the Union messages got much shorter once presidents began going up to deliver them in person. And then they started sending up a message shortly after that. So Wilson went in 1913 on several occasions. The Congress was sort of flummoxed when he asked to come up. They had to debate among themselves in the conferences whether this was okay. And they thought, well, yes, there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibited that. So he wanted to be the chief legislator as well as the chief executive. He prevails on the Senate to create the first majority leader. And that's John Worth Kern, a senator from Indiana, who is a junior senator but is a senior member of the party in many ways and is a very effective floor leader. He's the first official floor leader in the U.S. Senate. And it's Woodrow Wilson who famously in 1917 is so furious with a little group of willful men who filibustered against his bill to arm merchant ships just before the First World War that he prevails on the Senate to adopt its first cloture motion. So much of what we've been dealing with ever since are things that Wilson, as president, was able to institute. But Wilson's parliamentary parallel just went so far. His party was in the majority for the first 6 years, and they were voting as a binding caucus, and he was very successful in getting what he wanted. And then he asks the public to keep his party in power in 1918, and instead the Republicans win the majority in both the House and the Senate. And Wilson is decidedly unsuccessful during his last 2 years. If he'd been a prime minister, he would have resigned. But Wilson stuck to his fixed term and stayed the course and served in a very unhappy 2 years. I always remember I had a professor who once said that Woodrow Wilson was the A student who flunked the final, and that was always one of the great quandaries of dealing with him in American history. I think Woodrow Wilson would have really admired the vast expansion of American presidential power that took place during the Cold War. He would also, and I go back to Margaret Thatcher, I mentioned her earlier in my talk as an example of what a parliamentary government can do when you have a large parliament, a majority behind you, and you just have a will of iron to get things done. And last year, when I visited London, I stayed in the Country Hall Hotel across the Thames from just off Westminster Bridge from the Parliament. The County Hall once housed the Greater London Council. The Labour Party took control of the Greater London Council in 1981 under the leadership of a fiery leftist, Ken Livingstone, while the Conservatives controlled Parliament under Thatcher. Livingstone wanted to cut transit fares, so Thatcher cut the national grants to the London government, so they couldn't afford to do this. The London government just raised taxes so they could cut the transit fares. And then joblessness hit the UK in large numbers. Livingstone erected an enormous banner on the top of County Hall with the current unemployment rate, which could be read by the members of Parliament across the Thames. Mrs. Thatcher was a champion of localism against the powers of the central government, and polls showed that the Londoners overwhelmingly favored their local government, but she used her majority in Congress to sweep the London Council out of existence and to sell the County Hall to a hotel chain. So, this is not for nothing. I think that they call her an elected dictator. I also learned something years ago coming to a Wilson Center seminar when the Bureau of Labor Statistics chief in the United States and a counterpart from England were talking. In the United States, when bad economic news comes, it's delivered to the president and to Congress on the same day. In London, it goes to the prime minister. And a lot of those statistical reports wound up in her bottom desk drawer rather than ever being published at the time. So separation of powers definitely has some advantage. Let me wrap up my remarks here by saying that it's true that the U.S. Congress is slow and cumbersome and inefficient. But my reading of the Constitution is that's what the authors intended it to be. They did not want a system that fostered hasty action. They wanted to temper any sudden shifts in public opinion. They wanted to prevent undue concentration of power, to protect citizens' rights, and to hopefully forge some kind of consensus on national issues. Now, major changes in our system actually have taken place. Sometimes it takes time. The 17th Amendment, for instance, was first proposed in 1826 and was adopted in 1913. The powers of the House Speaker have evolved steadily over time. The United States Senate's cloture rule has undergone several transformations. We've had reforms for greater transparency and for stricter ethics. There's pressure for change on Congress all the time, and the most effective pressure comes from outside the institution, from voters who are unhappy, from new members who are elected to bring about those changes. So I think despite my institutional bias, I think Congress will change over time. It will respond to public concerns. But that said, I think it's highly unlikely that the United States government will ever resemble a parliamentary system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. The floor is open for comments and questions. If you could please wait for the microphone so we can tape your questions as well. We'll go to Bob Kaiser. It's coming right behind you.
Don, very good job. Thank you. I'd like to ask about the willing abdication of power, which some people at least see in the modern Congress, accepting the ascendance of the presidency, accepting that increase in presidential power that you referred to, and giving up to a considerable degree in recent years the power of oversight and really the power to harass the executive about policy and not just politics. Do you share that perception? And if you do, what caused it? Why has this happened?
I think there's an ebb and flow of this relationship. Certainly in terms of the president's overall power, there was a steady arc upward, especially during the Cold War years. I started working in the Senate in 1976, was just at a period when the Congress was just furious with presidential power and doing everything possible to rein it in and reassert itself. Of course, this was the exact same time that Dick Cheney was chief of staff in the White House, outraged that Congress would be trying to trim the Ford administration and setting, in course, his thinking about the unitary action of the presidency. So I think it goes back to Madison's ambition, counteracting ambition. Congress did abdicate a lot during the Cold War and got itself into a position where it did rubber stamp the president. We just recently published the 1968 volume for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's executive session hearings. And there's not a lot of new information in there because the Johnson administration wasn't giving the committee any new information. But there is a lot of anger among members who had loyally supported Johnson as president. People like Stuart Symington talking about this stupid war, he refers to it. It's costing us so much money and so much resources, and we have no control over it. And the complaints from from Senator Fulbright and others about how little control they had. And they spend the next several decades trying to figure out how do you control the president in foreign policy issues. And then again, then 2003, they rubber-stabbed essentially the war resolution in Iraq. And Senator Byrd, who was then the dean of the Senate, issued probably the most dramatic speech of his long career in the Senate about the abdication of legislative responsibilities. And so there's always those voices that unfortunately wasn't sufficient at the time. In terms of oversight, you mentioned, that usually depends on whose party is in the majority. If the president's party is in the majority, they tend to be much more restrained as to oversight. And if the president's party is not in the majority, then there's usually a lot of oversight in the process. Sometimes oversight becomes overkill, and there are periods in which everybody is being investigated, it seems. And that depends on what kind of political advantage sometimes is seen. But I've been surprised in this recent Congress that there haven't been more congressional investigations, not so much of the executive branch, but just of issues. I thought that this would have been a great time to have another Pecora investigation to look into why the banking system collapsed. And that was sort of punted to a commission as opposed to a committee of Congress. And maybe Congress is just too preoccupied with its legislative schedule to spend as much time in it. But a lot of congressional reputations have been made on effective oversight, and there are still a few in the Congress who have, can keep their cabinet secretaries very uncomfortable in the process. But I do think it's an ebb and flow situation. Yes.
Yep. Right.
Thank you very much for your paper, which I much enjoyed. I wonder, one or 2 points you allowed yourself to be a little counterfactual and asking what if and then. As you may remember, you've been to Canberra. You know the Australians speak of their system as being a Washminster system. That is a combination or hybrid of Washington and Westminster. The founders of the Australian Constitution, of course a Free British Act of Parliament, were very actively interested in watching what the Americans did, and they followed very closely the American founding fathers. But they didn't see the need for a revolution, and I wonder if I could interest you in looking counterfactually. Had there not been the disagreement with George III and with the Parliament dominated by the Lords, Lord North especially, and had the entire story continued, as it were, beyond the Reform Acts of 32, 66 in Britain, 88, what might have happened? That is to say, Parliament became much more responsive to the empire generally. Australia didn't find itself having to have a revolution in 1900 when the possibility permitted itself. It didn't. That is to say, is there something about the passage of time that might have produced a different kind of Congress, or is it, in your view, something quintessentially American that would have required the form of Congress to take shape in a way that you recognize today?
Forgive me for saying, my first thought was if it hadn't been for the American Revolution, the British government wouldn't have needed Australia. So that was, in a sense, it took care of a problem that we had disrupted for them to some degree. Yes, I think this is quite possible we would have evolved into something closer to the Canadian government, as if the Commonwealth had evolved at some point. But of course, the British government had to learn that they had to loosen up a little bit on their colonies to create some sort of more local government in the process. But I don't think anything was inevitable in that process. And there was a lot of, a lot of Americans were quite satisfied with being British subjects. And the estimate is only about a third were in favor of the revolution, a third favored the king, and a third could care less in the process. Right. It's quite possible that I don't think they were necessarily bound to create a system that they did. One of the other issues that I didn't mention earlier was that when John Adams returned, there were certain people who weren't at the Constitutional Convention. They were ministers abroad. Thank goodness Thomas Jefferson, the idealist, was not there because he would not have liked the pragmatic Constitution that came out in a lot of ways. And John Adams, who was contentious, would probably caused a lot of trouble if he'd been at the Constitutional Convention. But when he came back, he was the first vice president of the United States, and he spoke a blue streak, unlike most vice presidents. And he was constantly reminding people what they did in Parliament. And one of the big issues was when George Washington comes to be inaugurated, where should we do it? Well, they decided to do it on the second floor because they could have a balcony, and that happened to be the Senate chamber. Well, there weren't enough seats. Well, who stood and who sat? And Adams says, well, in Parliament, it's the members of the House of Lords who sit and the House of Commons who stand. And, they were quite happy to adopt the procedures, the style. Thomas Jefferson, as vice president, writes a rules manual for Congress, which we still honor in some respects, that is very much based on a book by the clerk of the House of Commons. And much of what Jefferson wanted, it was what he saw the Parliament, how they were proceeding in the process. So yes, it could very much have evolved into something closer to, I said, the Australian or the Canadian models. But the problem with all of those things is it takes one event to trigger another and trigger a response. And I think the fact that the American Revolution happened affected the British Parliament as much as it affected the American Constitution. The one thing I was trying to say, though, is that when people talk about we often talk about the Declaration of Independence as counter to that's the idealistic document, and the Constitution is the conservative document, and it's the tensions between them. But in fact, in the matters, I think both of them together had an impact on the way we designed a government, and they had very much the Declaration in mind when they were writing so without the Declaration, then they definitely would have probably created a different type of government.
Thank you, Roy. I thought that was a very useful question. Don?
You reminded me of a little briefing that I held on my way out the door in '97. I was Chief of Staff of the Rules Committee in the House, and I was addressing the Republican freshman class. And one of the questions that came up is, why do you still have a Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union? And nobody had ever asked me that before. I said, well, to keep secrets from the king. And they all sort of looked at me. But that's how it started. And but, why did we still have it? It was really to keep secrets from the public here in the U.S. I mean, originally there were no recorded votes in the Committee of the Whole on amendments, and so most of the work was done in the Committee of the Whole, even though it's open to the public, but the public really didn't know who was voting how, and so in 1971 they changed that, so why do we still have it? But I was wondering about the Senate, and the House threw open its doors after about a week in 1789. I think the Senate took a year or more.
6 years.
6 years, okay. But the Senate has always been lagging a little bit behind the House in transparency. I was just wondering whether you might just discuss that a little bit about the Senate's reluctance, even televising its own sessions.
The one thing about the Constitution is it does not require government business to be done in public, because it was written in secret itself. And it only requires that Congress from time to time publish a journal of its proceedings, which is the minutes of the journals of the Senate and House, not the congressional record. The House, on the very first day, opened its doors to the public because every member of the House was going to be running for re-election in 2 years, and they wanted the public to know what they were doing. Senators were elected by state legislatures. They saw no reason for a gallery or to opening the doors, and they met in secret, despite angry editorials in New York newspapers and Philadelphia newspapers. They finally opened the doors because they were having there was a question about seating a senator, whether or not he was a legitimate citizen of the United States, and they thought that if they did it in secret, it would be a star chamber. So they opened the doors just for that. And then once you open the doors, you really can't close them again. So they ordered a gallery to be built. Well, interestingly enough, the first reporters who showed up in the Senate press gallery found the proceedings so boring that they immediately went back to the House of Representatives, and that was where the action was in the early Congress. And but the Senate then took a leapfrog over the House in 1841 when the Senate established the first press gallery, and that was because the former Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, was now running the Senate, and he wanted to run for president, and he wanted the press to see what he was doing, and so he engineered a press gallery in the Senate in 1841. The House got one in 1857, the White House in 1902, just to show how far ahead the Senate was at that stage. So they go up and they go down in terms of what's open and what's closed. Nowadays, all the committee hearings, markups are open. As someone said to me, it's mostly lobbyists who go to the markups, and it's harder to compromise on anything if your lobbyists are looking over your shoulder. And what it's done is it's shifted a lot of the action back away from the members to the staff. And the staff are holding staff meetings that aren't open, making the deals that the members are then approving. And I've interviewed both senators and staff about this issue. And Senator Kennedy, in his memoir, says, the truth of the matter is 95% of the nitty-gritty work of the Senate is now done by staff. And this is Senator Kennedy, who was famous for doing so much, learning so much on his own. But I've asked the staff about this, and they say, yes, true, but if the members haven't been involved in cutting the deal, they're less invested in it. And you've got this great compromise worked out, and all of a sudden your members walk away from it in ways that they wouldn't if they had made the deal face-to-face among themselves. So it's like any other kind of reform. If you press down over here, it pops up over here. And so to try to make it transparent this way, you've created some areas in which you can't see what's going on. Frankly, for instance, like C-SPAN this year wanted to film the committees, the conference committees. Well, there's a point in which you've got to let politicians sit down around the table and figure out how to reach some sort of consensus. And it's hard to do that with the cameras facing on you. It just brings out the posturing in everybody. And I'm not completely in favor of 100% transparency. I think there are certain things that people ought to be able to work out in the process. Ultimately, they have to present it to the public, and they're going to face the voters, and they have to defend what they did. But I think the back room still has some advantages in the legislative process.
Can you talk about the difference between the House adopting televised floor proceedings in '79 and then the Senate?
Oh, yes. The House was happy to let the the cameras in, and the Senate was very reluctant because we have unlimited debate in the Senate, which would be unlimited television time. And the senior members kept saying, once you have this, nothing's ever going to get done. People are going to talk about everything. Senator Russell Long was really adamant about this. It's hard enough to get things passed through here. The junior members began to be concerned. A lot of them had come over from the House, and they missed the cameras. And some senators noticed that their congressmen and their delegations were better known at home than they were because people were watching C-SPAN. And so the pressure was pretty intense. And by 1986, the Senate opened its doors. And people ask me if television has changed things. Most of the people I interview, if I ask them what's changed in the Senate the most, television is always on their list. But I'm not sure. The one big difference is that if there's a big issue up, every senator feels they have to stand up and say something about it, and it does take longer. And people then talk about, well, why doesn't the majority leader have all-night filibusters? And I say, that's all-night television time for people who like to talk. And if you allow the opposition to just talk, they're going to get their message across. You're going to have to get your people out there to counteract them. So you're going to be out there talking just as much as they are, and that's going to stretch things out. It's not like Jimmy Stewart, although he did have cameras in 1939, but that was a different kind of filibuster in that sense. So I think television has changed a lot of the dynamics in the institution. But certainly the Senate has adjusted to Wi-Fi, and they've got everything is wireless in the building now. They've got digital recording studios for both parties. Senators are tweeting, or at least they have staff who are tweeting for them, and they're on Facebook. This is a group of people who are desperate to communicate with the voters and their constituents. And whatever form of communication works. And in fact, Henry Clay was quick to figure out how to use the telegraph, and current senators are using Facebook. So they want people to know what they're doing.
Thank you. Klaus Lewis over here.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk a lot, but I noticed you said, excuse me, you said that the American president looks envious to the British prime minister and believes he is much stronger. In Britain, people think it's the other way around. First of all, there's of course cabinet, so-called cabinet government. So the British prime minister cannot just dismiss his ministers. They have a constituency and a power by themselves. So I think that he is much more bound in by the cabinet than is an American president. A strong Secretary of State like Clinton or Powell was in some respect is rather the exception rather than the rule, I think. Secondly, I think a strong parliament or the prime minister is only stronger in a parliamentary sense when he has a large majority, which again is usually the exception. Margaret Thatcher, you mentioned, of course, it was the case. Tony Blair initially, yes. But when you think of Gordon Brown, if you think of the current constellation, or Harold Wilson in the past, they were not parliamentary strong leaders. So I think in these cases, the American president usually must be regarded as much stronger than the British prime minister. Thank you.
Yes, I totally agree with your comments, and I did try to preface at the beginning that the parliamentary systems allow majorities to get their way, presuming that there is a majority. And of course, that's always been a weakness of some systems, that there are so many different parties. One of the miracles of the American political system is that it's remained a two-party system. There are very few parliaments that can operate as a two-party body. There are, of course, some people who see that as weakness and wish that we had parties that were really reflective of more public opinion. There's a large part of public opinion that feels excluded to some degree because of the parties, of big tent parties that tend to compromise their positions, and that's an issue as well. But when a parliamentary system has a majority, of course, then it does work in a remarkably efficient way. And of course, you mentioned the cabinet, and that's another issue. Is of course there's a shadow cabinet. We have no shadow cabinet here, and there are people who are ready to step up as cabinet ministers immediately and can take over when the government has changed, whereas it takes presidents months to put their cabinet together, to convince people to get into the cabinet, then to convince the Senate to confirm those nominations. And so the American cabinet is much more dependent on the president than the cabinet that exists in the parliamentary system. So yes, there are strengths and weaknesses in the process. I use Margaret Thatcher because she is sort of the extreme in that process, but certainly exceptional. Of course, when the authors of the Constitution were writing the Constitution, they kind of hoped there weren't going to be political parties. They knew there would be. I mean, they anticipated them, but they really were hoping that there wouldn't necessarily be fixed factions. And it's quite possible the American system could have evolved with multiple parties. I actually, years ago, I wrote my master's thesis on what happened to Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party after it came in second in the presidential election in 1912, why it disappeared by 1916, and looked at how they thought that they had a good chance of becoming a viable party, if not the second party, at least a third party. And the American system frustrated them constantly. Wilson's binding caucus rule cut them out of any kind of deal-making in the Senate. And then the progressives helped to push through direct election of senators. And the first direct election takes place in 1914. And the public are supposed to solve all these problems by electing different people. And every single incumbent senator who was up for re-election in 1914 got re-elected. The public elected exactly the same people that the state legislatures did. It turned out there was no disconnect between legislatures and the way they looked at what was in the best interest of the states and the voters were. It just took the steam out of the progressive movement. And the progressives, their solution to everything was the people would do better. And when the people elect someone like Boyce Penrose over Gifford Pinchot in Pennsylvania, your argument is gone at that stage. So, we've been very fortunate in that we've stayed to a two-party system. Most parliamentary governments are coalition governments, and there's a certain degree of fragility to that makes the Prime Minister much more of a diplomat than a dictator.
Ken McDonald.
I think Don's just answered most of my question, but I was going to ask about why.
Microphone.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Thank you. I was going to ask, when the Constitutional Convention, as I recall, was very much against party as being faction, although they had the example of Britain in front of them, and I would suppose many thought that was one to be discarded. But it very rapidly evolved into a two-party system. And you've mentioned things like the single-member constituency that helped that happen. But so how strong was the opinion against it, and why did it end up not a tightly disciplined two-party system, but nevertheless a very enduring two-party system?
Well, ironically, the first parties began to evolve in response to the Constitution, between those who favored adopting it and those who opposed it. And so right away, the authors of the Constitution wound up out there promoting the enactment of their Constitution against organized groups that were opposed, very vigorously opposed. And that was the seeds of the party system. And the various periods when parties have sort of coalesced and collapsed, they've always sort of worked their way out into a second party. And I mentioned the one stipulation was as early as the 1840s. The two parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, agreed to nominate people to committees in the Senate by conference, so that the Whigs had their list and the Democrats had their list, and they both agreed to that. Suddenly in the 1850s, these Republicans started showing up, and they wouldn't join either. They didn't want to be part of either conference, but they also wanted to be on committees, and they were protesting in the Congressional Record about being discriminated against in that process. So we've had to adjust to the at various times, but I think I go back again to the Electoral College as being something that ambitious political figures realize that you can't have a third party that is a ideological party or a regional party. It's got to be a national party, and it's got to be a broadly based party. If you get too narrowly based, you're going to shut yourself out of the Electoral College, and we revert right back to the two parties along the way. People talk about abolishing the Electoral College, and I always wonder, well, what would the consequences be in a case like that? Would you elect a president of the United States with less than a majority vote? Could you have multiple parties running? Would you need a runoff election for president? We've had some very difficult elections, including 1800, nobody got a majority, 1824, 1876, 2000, and all of them have created enormous ill will. I'm reading a biography of Henry Clay right now, and I knew how angry the Jacksonians were after the election of 1824, but just really hadn't appreciated how vituperative they were and how impossible they made governing for Adams and Clay after the supposed corrupt bargain. So, the Electoral College has actually worked in the long run to stabilize the system. The other thing we have is our fixed terms, which is, Parliament. The British Parliament has a fixed term of 5 years. There has never been one, I think, at least since World War I, that's actually gone the full 5 years. British Parliament prime ministers always dissolve when they think it's in their advantage or when they're desperate to dissolve the Parliament in advance. Those fixed terms in Congress have also created a different atmosphere in the process. And the House of Representatives, has the shortest fixed term of any national legislature, 2 years. They're constantly running. If anybody said, if you had your way to add an amendment to the Constitution, I think I would increase House terms to 4 years and work at a system so that there were no off-year congressional elections, that members of Congress always ran at the same time the president did. So there was a little bit more parallel between the presidential mood and the congressional mood, with hopefully the Senate maybe having some cycle in the process. But
Don, I actually thought that Ken was going to ask a question about CIA.
Yeah.
The British system, I think the British Parliament, MI6 secrets are probably better kept on the British side than on the American. But could you just comment briefly on the tension, present state of play of the tension between the Congress and intelligence information?
It's interesting. I think it's sort of a myth that Congress leaks more than the administration does, and it's that the congressional intelligence committees are scrupulous about keeping secrets. Yeah. Right. And a recent book by David Barrett on Congress and the CIA in the 1950s and 60s showed that Congress had a lot more information about the CIA than was letting on, especially the members of the Appropriations Committee. This fellow went around the country from place to place looking at all these congressional papers and found loads of stuff about the workings of the CIA that members of Congress knew about but certainly weren't talking about at the time. But there's nothing new to this. Back in the 19th century, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo leaked out before Senate had opened it up. And the Senate immediately arrested the reporter who published it and held him prisoner in the Capitol building until he divulged his secrets. And his newspaper doubled his salary for every day he was held in captivity. And he continued to file reports from the Capitol Bastille, as he referred to it. And they eventually let him go at the end of the session. And historians are pretty well convinced that it was the Secretary of State who leaked the treaty because it was in the advantage of the administration to get it out. That was James Buchanan, who later became president. So even then, Congress is being blamed for leaks that were coming out of the administration.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I want to. Somebody's been very patient there. So
I wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to ask you a question about Wilson, who you talked about. And indulge me because it sort of comes from work I'm working on right now. To what extent do you think that Wilson's appearances before Congress, whether the State of the Union messages or when he was launching certain legislation, had any persuasive power? I mean, if he had a Democratic Congress, if they had this binding rule, were they going to go with him anyway, and was this ceremonial, or was there some innovation in how presidents could actually lead Congress? And then a follow-up, if you have time, just to ask, once these messages started being televised years later, did they cease to really be directed at Congress, and are they just directed at all of us?
Yeah. I think Wilson's personal appearance in the beginning, at least, had an electrifying effect on Congress. And Wilson, of course, chortled at the fact that he thought of something that Theodore Roosevelt hadn't thought of. He knew it would just frustrate Roosevelt. And Roosevelt had been very frustrated with his dealings with Congress. Roosevelt used to say, if I got a third of what I asked Congress to do, I feel lucky. Wilson had a much better track record. And I think what Wilson was doing was he was there as a party cheerleader. I think he was talking to his party, his notoriously fractious party. Wilson had been elected with a minority of the popular vote. He was not repealing to, for the most part, to progressives and to Republicans. He was trying to keep the Democrats together, and he was down there as much as possible. He came, actually, his first visit was not for the State of the Union. It was for, I think, for the tariff bill. I think, and a number of other issues. And then he came back in December to do the State of the Union message, which is more of a laundry list of issues. But I think it had a big impact. Now, obviously, when he came to talk about the Treaty of Versailles before the Senate, he was less influential in part because his party was now in the minority in the process. And presidents have always had that problem of sometimes you can get too close to Congress. You know, George Washington tried to go to deliver his treaty to Congress, and it didn't work. He said, you know, this defeats my whole purpose of being here, when they referred it to a committee and walked out. Every president, however, since Wilson, except for Herbert Hoover, has delivered messages to Congress. And Hoover was one of those people who didn't think Congress was a necessary branch of government. And that was an indication of his congressional relations, that he's the only one who didn't do that. Today, I think you're right that television has made it a national speech, and it's become this cheerleading issue. And members of the president's party have to stand 50 times, and the others sit down quietly. It's a strange ceremony. It's evolved into something different than I think Wilson had in mind. But all the newspaper accounts and all the things that I've read, at least for 1913, 1914, was that Wilson really shot some adrenaline into his party by being there in person.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. Unless you have anything else to add, let's give a round of thanks to John for a really wonderful talk. Thank you for your wonderful part in this conversation, which I would like to invite you to continue over a glass of wine or some nibbles outside, a bit further down, not right outside as we have in the past, but closer to the atrium. Thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you. We both hope to see you next week with Frédéric Bouzou on Mitterrand. Thank you.